What you are is a follower of Eusebius. It's in the Gospels.
A reading from the definitive commentary on Pliny's letter to Trajan on the Christians and Trajan's response by A.N. Sherwin-White, 1966 A.D. It is hardly necessary to defend the genuine character of these two letters. That was a reading from Sherwin-White's commentary on Pliny. In fact, that is the first line of his commentary on the letter about Christians. Just as an aside, imagine if you were reading a commentary on The Wasteland and the first sentence was, "There's no reason to doubt that T.S. Eliot wrote this." Now, I've said many times in this series that the apologists all maintain that Pliny's letter is genuine, and I pointed out in episode 10 that for the most part, they don't know anything about Pliny or his letters, but they always repeat that all scholars say that it's genuine. And what they mean is Sherwin-White said that it was genuine. Sherwin-White is the guy. His commentary on Pliny's letters, he laid out the arguments, and everyone who argues for the Pliny letters' authenticity follows his arguments to this day. And for that reason, this series is really a dialogue between me and him. Everyone today who defends this letter is almost not even worth reading. They are all ultimately commenters in Sherwin-White's comment section. And he was a historian of ancient history, at least primarily, but he somehow was also a Christian apologist, and he wrote a lot about the New Testament and early Christianity, and he was fundamentally conservative in his views of Christian origins because he was an ardent believer. However, he was also probably the biggest expert on Pliny's letters that has ever existed. And when I started this series, I was using a smaller commentary of his as well as some of his papers, but his major work, the full commentary on Pliny, is actually pretty rare, and I didn't have it at first. And to find a copy of it that costs under $1 trillion, you have to go to some fairly prodigious lengths. Like, you have to visit the night witch of the swamps of Lake Mayotis, and she'll tell you to go outside under a pink moon and recite from the Necronomicon while standing over a concoction brewed out of rock salt from an asteroid and 3 blonde hairs from a horned griffin's nutsack that you had to steal from its nest atop the mountains of time on the frontier of Great Cathay. And originally I figured I could get by without it, but I realized that if I'm going to do this Pliny series, and this is going to end up being my definitive statement on this thing, and as I'm slowly coming to recognize, it'll probably and unfortunately end up being the thing that this show is remembered for. But if I'm going to do this, I decided that I'm going to do it the right way. And so I followed the instructions of the Night Witch, and I obtained Sherwin-White's commentary on Pliny's letters. And this is the first sentence of his discussion of the Christian's letter. It's hardly necessary to defend its genuineness. Not, hey folks, it's the Christian letter. No, he begins with the official slogan of Christian apologists everywhere, there's no reason to doubt. Now, in the close reading, I've already been engaging with a lot of Sherwin-White's arguments because, like I said, I had his smaller commentary, and I'll continue to engage with them, but I thought that here I would cover his introduction to the letter in his major commentary, where he lays out his key arguments. And what is his first argument that he advances to prove the authenticity of Pliny's letter? Well, it may not surprise you, but it's the same argument that theologians use to defend the authenticity of Paul's letters, the writing style. Now, first of all, a writer's style is not like their fingerprint or DNA that it would be impossible for any other writer on earth to have or to imitate. And the Latin language in general is not like Tamarian or something. It's highly inflected. There's only a finite amount of ways to piece words together to form a sentence. And it also shouldn't surprise you that the argument for authenticity based on style always seems to be being put forward by people who are full-time academics and professors to whom plagiarism is like one of the top 5 worst things that ever happened in the history of the universe. And every academic sees himself as a kind of forensic text detective when they have to suss out plagiarism from their students, and now they fancy themselves to be experts on style, and they're like, yep, definitely an authentic letter of Paul. Looks like his work. And it's like, thanks, Columbo. It's comforting to know that these guys are authenticating Christian letters with the same method that they use to authenticate an 18-year-old's homework.
Is this your homework, Larry? Is this your homework, Larry?
Look, man.
Please.
Is this your homework, Pliny? It's not impossible to mimic someone's style, and that should be manifestly obvious, but all the more so in the ancient world, where part of one's education was to mimic the style of famous poets and writers. You're learning to do that as a child, in fact. That's how you learn how to write. And we can imagine the proficiency that a literary forger would have coming out of that kind of background. And if you're going to use style as an argument for something being authentic, make it your 50th argument or something, or bring it up only as an aside. By no means should you ever be using it as your first argument. It actually reminds me of that thing from Muslim apologetics, where it says that the Quran has to be the true word of God because it's written in such a beautiful style, which not even the best poets could imitate. I guess other than the poets who wrote it down in the first place. But needless to say, Sherwin-White would not appreciate someone arguing that the Quran has to be the word of God because it's written in a pretty style. So we can dispense with this argument on style, and I never want to hear it again. Style is useful for identifying interpolations, but it can't prove a writer's identity. I've used style arguments to suggest that Galatians had 5 separate writers, but notice how I didn't thereby try to demonstrate who those writers actually were. At the end of the day, they were just some guys, and Pliny's letter was forged by just some guy. But the next argument that Sherwin-White gives is a pretty intriguing one, actually. He says that Pliny was very exact in his technical language and usage when talking about Roman legal procedures, and a forger wouldn't be likely to do that on his own. And here are the examples that he gives. The crimes associated with the name, which we already talked about in the last episode as being a Christian formula. I led them away to be executed. Don't see why it would take a lawyer to be familiar with a term like that. I mean, I get that lawyers in the ancient world had certain specialized training, but it's not like you had to be some kind of wizard to be familiar with the fairly basic legal terminology that's used in this letter, to say nothing of the fact that Tertullian, who is on the short list of possible forgers of this thing, was clearly very familiar with legal terminology and may have been trained as a lawyer, certainly trained as a rhetorician. Also, the Roman playwright Plautus used this same expression that Pliny uses in his play The Prisoners from the 3rd century BC, and he was decidedly not a lawyer. In fact, he was supposedly a carpenter before treading the boards, so to speak. Because they were Roman citizens, I remitted them to the city. I mean, we talked extensively about the Roman citizens thing last time, and I in fact think that the forger was actually confused here. He seems to be aware that Roman citizens would be treated differently, but he defaults to having them shipped to Rome like Ignatius was and like Paul was, instead of appealing to Trajan in his actual presence. And Sherwin-White gives more examples in a similar vein, but here's where he introduces one of his main arguments for authenticity when he says, quote, above all, where could a forger have learned about the special edict against collegia, which is not specified elsewhere in Book 10? What he's talking about is where the apostate Christians told Pliny that they'd given up their weekly meetings after Pliny had banned social clubs following Trajan's instructions. And it's a good question that Sherwin-White asks. And when I read that, I was like, damn, guess I need to end this Pliny series. So I started to close the book sadly, just kind of desultorily flipping back through the pages, and wouldn't you know it, through my tears, I glimpsed Pliny's letter 93, only 3 installments prior to the Christians' one, and in it, Trajan says, if the citizens of Amisos are allowed by their own laws to form a benefit society, there's no reason why we should interfere, especially if the contributions aren't used for riotous and unlawful assemblies, but to relieve cases of hardship among the poor. In all other cities that are subject to our own law, these institutions must be forbidden. So the answer to the question of how a forger could learn about Trajan's edict against social clubs is that he read about it on the previous frickin' page. Now, if you remember in episode 13, I wondered why the Christians of the 5th century put the forged Pliny letter in the specific place that they did within the collection. And I said that one reason could be that Pliny, during this leg of his journey, was out in the burgs, and so they felt safe sticking this Christian letter there as opposed to having this whole saga take place in Nicaea or Nicomedia, which had a certain cachet, and so it would have raised questions. Christians living there in the forger's time could have said, hey, why didn't we know anything about this? Why isn't any of this preserved in our records? But actually, the likeliest reason as to why this Christian's letter ended up as letter 96, as opposed to, say, letter 42 or letter 3 or something, was that the fraudsters who slipped it in at that place were unsure whether Trajan's statement that I just read was a standing law or something that he literally just came up with in that one specific communication with Pliny. And in the Christian's letter, indeed, as Sherwin-White says, Pliny brings up Trajan's ban against social clubs. And therefore, the Christian compiler figured that it's probably safest to put the Christian's letter as soon after that one as possible. And if you look at the flow of Pliny's letters, letter 92 was him asking Trajan whether the city of Amisos could form a benefit society. Letter 93 is Trajan responding to that, basically saying IDGAF, but make sure that you prohibit benefit societies everywhere else according to our law. And letter 94 is Pliny asking Trajan to let Suetonius have the privilege of kids' meal prices at Burger King. And letter 95 is Trajan agreeing to that, but being a real jerk about it. And of course, letter 96 is the Christian's letter, where Trajan's edict against clubs is prominently mentioned. So what I'm saying is that the Christian's letter itself was indeed forged in the 190s, but as a standalone letter. It ended up in Tertullian's compilation book, as I'll talk about in a minute, but it wasn't part of what we would call the manuscripts of Book 10. But it was placed there by Christians in the 5th century, and they made their decision to put it in this specific place based not only on what I said about the safe obscurity of the places where Pliny was writing from, but much more importantly, because of the fact that Trajan had just got done talking about his ban of clubs in letter 93. And so we find quite the opposite of what Sherwin-White is contending. It's really ignorance that governs the mention of Trajan's edict here, not expertise. And of course, for my theory to work here, Book 10 had to have existed and been in circulation at the time of the forgery so that the forger could have read letter 93. Well, it's a good job then that in episode 10, I stated that our working position would be that Book 10 is genuine and early in some form, with the exception of the Christian's letters. But when it comes down to it, the main argument that Sherwin-White gave for the letter's authenticity is that Tertullian talks about it in the year 197 AD in his Apology book. And at the end of the day, Tertullian's supposed use of Pliny's letter is probably the only relevant argument for its being genuine. That's why in this series, it was the very first thing that I addressed. It was like a first strike, like in the Cold War. And I pointed out that in Tertullian's discussion of Pliny's letter, as even Sherwin-White points out, he doesn't appear to be working off of the same text that we see in our modern editions of Pliny. And not only that, but all the indications in his discussion of it point to it being a Christian forgery that he had found in a now lost florilegium of pagan testimonies about the Romans' treatment of Christians. And please see the full discussion in episode 10 for more on that. But whatever Tertullian was talking about, whatever he was doing when he discussed Pliny, should be one of the great mysteries of the scholarship of early Christian origins. I'm damn curious about it myself. In fact, Tertullian should do an Ask Me Anything. You know how on Reddit they have the various features like Ask Me Anything or Am I the Asshole? Well, it'd be pointless for Tertullian to do Am I the Asshole because in every single scenario that he brings up, the answer would be yes. But if he did ask me anything, I would ask him specifically where he got his information about the Pliny and Trajan correspondence, because his use of it raises more questions than it answers if he actually had the genuine letters in front of him. I mean, you know how they say, which historical figures would you invite to dinner? I would invite this man, Tertullius, And my one and only question to him would be, dude, what in the blue hell were you referencing when you talked about Pilate converting to Christianity and Pliny the Younger when he ruled a province and drove some Christians from their steadfastness? But he also brings up about 4 other documents in the same apology book, all of which share similar themes, all of which have to do with the Roman persecution of Christians, all of which end up with the Romans prescribing a form of light treatment of the Christians. And you have to wonder why theologians have no issues with declaring those 4 other documents to be forgeries, but not this one. I was asked recently by a Christian apologist in a Facebook group, what do I have to say to the fact that the scholarly consensus is that Pliny's letter about Christians is genuine? And here's the thing. Always remember that when these theologians or even historians are analyzing these documents, it doesn't really occur to them to set their analysis aside for a moment and say, why don't I write up a big 50,000 word demonstration that Pliny's letter is genuine? In many cases, as I think I'm showing, forgery is a better explanation for these documents that better fits the evidence. But theologians are busy writing papers like why Pliny used a specific verb in line 12. If they were able to demonstrate and to believe that this letter is actually a forgery, then the next thing they would have to do is click and drag and highlight all the contents of their work computer and drag them to the recycle bin, because all the work that they do is based on the fundamental assumption that these documents are genuine. And no one has really ever done a scholarly line-by-line demonstration that Pliny's letter is genuine since Sherwin-White, since 1966, if he can even be said to have done that. And on this topic, by the way, no one has ever done a thorough analysis proving the authenticity of the Tacitus passage about Christians. And also remember that these theologians do research and write papers for a living. They're not doing this for the pursuit of truth. And if you get into areas like Paul's letters were possibly forged, Pliny's letter was possibly forged, then you're really undermining everything you and your field stand for and everything that your career is based on. And then it also gets into like weird political territory, like professional respect, because a lot of these theologians, these academics, respect one another as mentors and colleagues. And when you start straying too far from the basic assumptions of the field, it could rightly be construed as a slap in the face to those mentors and colleagues. I remember in one of Bart Ehrman's books, he talks about a former student of his who was out to demonstrate that the Josephus passage about Jesus was a forgery. And Bart Ehrman played up the person's youth, went out of his way to call him a graduate student, and kind of implied that this was part of his rebellious phase, kind of his Rumspringa. And, Bart Ehrman was like, his paper was intriguing, but I'm afraid it didn't pass muster. And Ehrman, of course, name-checked Alice Wheely and some other mainstreamers who'd written against the paper and shot it down. So the Academy closed ranks. But here, the hypothesis that a Christian forger created this document in the late 100s AD explains everything. Otherwise, we're just going to be confused by all the weird problems in this text. And here's something else we need to talk about. If you ask most people who are into this stuff to describe Pliny's letter, they usually say something like this. Pliny was presiding over trials of Christians, but while he was conducting the trials, more information came to light. And he wasn't sure exactly how to go about conducting the trials in light of all the new information, and so he asked Trajan for advice. That is a summary that one can derive only from the barest surface level reading of this thing, because what we in fact have is a document that assumes that Christianity is illegal, but at the same time doesn't know whether it's illegal or why. We have a letter written by a pagan, but at the same time it contains allusions to Christian martyria written a century later. We have a document written at a time in which we're told that the Romans confounded Christians with Jews, but at the same time it shows no knowledge that Christianity is even remotely related to Judaism. We have a letter written by a man who usually takes careful note of his surroundings, tells us precisely where he's writing from, but at the same time, this specific letter seems like it was written in the Sargasso Sea. A letter that declares that Christianity is somehow a mortal threat, but at the same time treats it with kid gloves when describing it, or happily reports that it doesn't seem that these people were doing anything wrong. a letter written by a famous Roman statesman that supposedly circulated widely in the empire, but only one person can possibly be said to have read it for 14 entire centuries. A letter that mysteriously reflects Christian stereotypes about persecution that were still in currency 8 decades after its purported date of composition. The hypothesis of a Christian forger who composed Pliny's letter as a standalone text that made its way into a curious little florilegium that was used by Tertullian and was eventually added to the main body of the letters in the 5th century. This explains all these strange elements in the letter. And remember, there's nothing preventing this. No prohibitively early testimony, no earlier citations, certainly no archaeological testimony. At the end of all things, and you and I and everyone else, no matter what they say, everyone recognizes this in their hearts. The only real argument is it seems authentic. And I want to make one thing clear. Never forget this. Pliny's letter is a fake, but if Pliny the Younger did write about Christians to Trajan in the year 112, that letter would not be something that Christian apologists would want to read, because Christianity would have barely existed at the time. And if Pliny did have occasion to encounter Christians, it would be, in the eyes of modern theologians, a perverse and heterodox faith that he'd be describing. It would show a lack of development, a lack of consensus, syncretism with local pagan religions, syncretism with rabbinic Judaism. It would in fact reveal that the Romans didn't have any prior knowledge of this sect, dashing to pieces the myths of the persecutions by Nero and Domitian. It would show that they lacked authoritative books other than the Jewish scriptures. It would show that Christians were more inclined to drop the dime on their sectarian opponents than to band together in solidarity and die for the name. And Pliny's investigation of Christianity would be the first such investigation ever undertaken by a Roman official, and his question to Trajan would be not some ridiculously Byzantine query about whether we should try them for the name or the associated crimes, but rather, does this perverse syncretic cult require countermeasures to be taken against it? It would be brutal and upsetting to read, a far cry from the nice, neat, peaceful orthodoxy with its willing martyrs banding together to eat an innocent meal, which is itself a fantasy concocted at the writing tables of the late 2nd century Catholic theologians and projected into the past. And I think that the apologists all recognize this somewhere in the recesses of their minds with their shrill vehemence in defending Pliny's letter. They have a doubt. They know that something's wrong with this letter, and we see that even in the first sentence of Sherwin-White's commentary on it. When we read it, we're reminded of what they said about the brain bug at the end of the movie. It's afraid. You're listening to Born in the 2nd Century, and it's now 5 p.m. on October 13th, 2021. This is episode 15 of the regular series, which is a grand expose of Christianity's late origin, hosted by Chris Palmero. The music for today's broadcast was provided by the recording group Pompeii Gray. Pompeii Gray has posted a new album of music from this telebroadcast, which can be streamed on Apple Music, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and YouTube. It's free streaming on most of those, and I put more information about them into the episode description for each show. Also, for those unaware, the episode description for each show also includes chapters on some platforms, at least on Apple Podcasts it does, and this allows you to essentially skip around to different parts of the episode. It's all part of the painstaking preparation that I do for this. And speaking of, I would also like to announce the foundation of Born in the 2nd Century's Patreon page. It can be found at patreon.com/Born in the 2nd Century. It's available for anyone who enjoys the show and wants to contribute to its improvement. Now, specifically, the ultimate goal is to do more shows, and I can, once it makes economic sense to do that. What I would really like to do is a mainline Born in the 2nd Century show every other week. And in the weeks in between, I want to do a sort of laid-back commentary on a specific Christian text, or even a book by a theologian. And ideally, I also want to discuss apologetics materials and podcasts and refute them from the standpoint of Christianity having a late origin. But in the meantime, I'm always looking for ways to improve the show in its existing format. I'm looking at better soundproofing and audio quality, but the main expense is always the books and research materials and the academic papers and databases. Now, I often say that when it comes to books, that even if I wasn't doing the show, I'd probably end up buying those myself anyway, because I love the material. And if I weren't doing an actual podcast, then Born in the Second Century would just be me reading those books, developing my theories, and accosting people on the street or steering conversations at parties and weddings to the late origins of Christianity and then dominating the conversation. Kind of like when Homer Simpson learned all about Thomas Edison and that's all he wanted to talk about with everyone. But supporting the show will allow it to become more of a force for stability in this world than it already is. So patreon.com/born in the second century. So please consider it. And remember that my goal here is to expand. I don't have any other goals than doing this show. It's not like Bill Mitchell moving to Miami or something. I mean, my life is basically working 8 hours at the work factory and coming back and doing Christianity stuff, basically. And before we begin the show today, I want to welcome our first converts into the wisdom of God hidden in a mystery. I don't want you to be unaware, brothers, that Stu has made the pledge and is now aware that Christianity was born in the second century. I boast about Amelia, and my boasting about her has not been empty. Lucas has provided seed to the sower. Todd has made an abundance for every good deed, as it is written. And because of Scott, we overflow with many thanksgivings. And those were quotes from 2 Corinthians 9, which was a secondary addition to that letter that was added by an editor. And I feel confident that I'm using that material in the way that the author intended. But before we move forward today, I need to issue some clarifications on the last show. I actually need to go back and issue another red card to Pliny. I feel like he doesn't have enough yet. When I was reading the letter last time, in the English translation portion, I used a certain phrase that I think wasn't as clear as it could have been. It was the part where Pliny said that he killed the confessing Christians for being obstinate. And he justified it by saying, I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, inflexible obstinacy ought to be punished. That's the translation that I read on air. But an even more accurate translation of that phrase, qualecunque esset quod faterentur, would be whatever it was that they were admitting. So Pliny literally said that he executed the Christians because, quote, I had no doubt that whatever it was that they were admitting to, inflexible obstinacy ought to be punished. It's actually even worse than I made it out to be in episode 14. I said that the forger needed to have Pliny kill Christians because that's what the persecution trope dictates. But because Pliny said that he didn't know what the charge was, he had to make up the spurious reason of obstinacy as to why he executed them. And the forger here appears to be admitting how ridiculous it sounds by having Pliny essentially say, whatever they're guilty of, it's probably bad. Again, the kind of thing that only makes sense to a contemporary Christian who's familiar with the idea that Christians are killed by the Romans as a matter of course and accepts that, but totally incomprehensible in the actual context of this letter if we're to accept it as genuine, in which Pliny is writing to the emperor to get a sense of what the very charge should be. Also, in the last episode, I mentioned that the forger of Pliny's letter was pulling his punches by referring to Christianity by using the tame term amentia, or madness. Madness is also the term that the Christian forgery called the Acts of the Skeleton Martyrs also uses and puts it into the mouth of the Roman persecutor, although there in Latin it's dementia as opposed to amentia. So here's an example of how the word dementia was used in Latin literature. It's Julius Caesar, the Gallic Wars, quote, Caesar concluded that waiting until the enemy's forces were augmented and their cavalry had returned would be the greatest dementia, end quote. So when applied to Christianity, we can see that it's negative indeed, but not too negative, right? I like to imagine a Christian cleric who tells his scribe, okay, go forge an anti-Christian letter in the name of a pagan. And he comes back with his first effort, and he has the pagan say things like, yeah, I can't wait till we eliminate this stupid, dumb, stupid religion where they make you write for 16 hours a day. And like the cleric like horsewhips him and makes him try again, but use milder language this time. And you can see that in pretty much all the testimonies about Christians by pagans, except that of Lucian, the one genuine one. Either they're way too hilariously over the top and condemning Christianity, or they're giving Christians a love tap. Also, in episode 13, I talked about Pliny's use of the term Christian, and I said that if the term originated as a slur among Latin speakers, that Pliny's use of it could make sense if the letter was genuine. And Pliny would actually be the very first Roman to ever use it, at least that we have documented evidence of. However, please note that in Pliny's own testimony, the people that he's trying and interrogating are also calling themselves Christian. So it isn't enough to say, well, it makes sense that Pliny would be throwing around the term Christian. It's a Latin slur, but he's a Latin speaker who has negative attitudes towards Christians, so it makes sense. No, you also have to account for why the Christians who are on trial are also answering to the term Christian and not saying, hey, we should be called brethren, we should be called saints, we should be called Jews. It makes much more sense to posit this as a late forgery that's using an anachronism rather than go to these lengths to try to explain why everyone happens to be using the term Christian or why or what. But today we continue our close reading of Pliny's letter about the Christians and Trajan's response. Supposedly written in 112 AD, and therefore supposedly one of the earliest external witnesses to the Christian religion. But I'm maintaining that it was actually forged by a Christian cleric of the late 2nd century who wanted to influence the legal discourse surrounding the persecution of Christians by the Romans, whether that persecution was real, exaggerated, or imagined. A few times on this show I've mentioned close readings, and I plan to do them for all the biblical texts as well. I think that that's one thing that's sorely lacking on the Christian Apologetics podcast that I listen to for this, but maybe if they would cut out that awkward chatter that they all do at the beginning about beer and football and fantasy football, which like 75% of them do for some reason, they'd have more time to do a close reading, especially when you're doing like a 30 or 45-minute podcast. And what are you doing? But we're going to continue through the letter today and provide a running commentary by means of our red cards, our specific arguments against the letter's authenticity. In making our way through this letter, let's always keep our key question in mind, whether or not it's impossible to view it as a forgery. Back after this. When we last left Pliny the Younger, he had encountered two distinct groups of Christians. The first group, which was brought before him by a prosecutor, all confessed their faith. The second group, brought to his attention by an anonymous pamphlet, all denied their faith. From this, we learned that policing in the Roman Empire was more effective than even the pre-crime unit from Minority Report, which was set in the year 2054. Pliny, who in his letter indicates that he doesn't know practically anything about Christians and doesn't know what the charge usually is, nonetheless efficiently executed the confessing Christians. Well, he said that he executed them for being obstinate after he asked them 3 times if they were a Christian. How are they obstinate? You don't even know what the charge is. It would be like if an American judge said to the defendant, "State your name," and he said it, and the judge was like, "I hereby sentence you to life in prison." He sentenced them to death for answering a question truthfully. Even one of the commentators that I'm using, Wynne Williams, remarks on how strange that is. Now, does that lead Wynne Williams to question whether the letter is authentic? Nope. By the way, here there's another massive contradiction in Pliny's letter that immediately exposes it as a forgery. Notice how he said about the confessing Christians that he asked them 3 times, warning them of the punishment. Then, when they persisted, he executed them for obstinacy. So, when you were warning them of the punishment, what was it a punishment for? I mean, surely it wasn't a punishment for obstinacy, but by the logic of this letter, it also couldn't have been a punishment for being a Christian, because Pliny started out by saying that he doesn't know what the specific charge is in trials of Christians. Now, the forger of this letter believes that Christians are punished by the Romans simply for being Christians, but he wants to change that in a certain specific way, and the vehicle that he employs to bring that about is a letter from a Roman official whom he depicts as not knowing anything about Christianity, almost as if he's learning about it in real time and seeing himself how contradictory the Roman treatment of Christians is. And then he can say to the emperor, like, is this right? Should we be doing this? But you see how it creates all these contradictions when he also has that same official behaving like the stereotypical Roman persecutor that he's familiar with from the Christian literature. It makes no sense. Anyway, Pliny executes the confessing Christians for no reason or ridiculous reason, and then for the denying Christians, he, the first person to ever use the term Christian, the first person to ever successfully distinguish Christians from Jews, the first person to put the question to the Christians multiple times in their trials, also becomes the first ever person to prove that the Christians denied their faith by compelling them to worship the traditional gods and the image of the emperor. All in a day's work for Pliny. We continue now with the close reading. Pliny, activate.
Alia bindice nominati esse Christianos dixerunt et mox negaverunt. Fuisse quidem sed decisse, quidam ante trienum, quidam ante plures annos, non nemo etiam ante viginti. Iquoque omne sed imaginam tuam deorumque simulacra venerati sunt, et Christo maledixerunt. Ad firmabant autem, hanc fuisse summum vel culpae suae vel errores, quod essen soliti statu die de ante lucem convenire, carmenque Christo quasi Deo dicere secum in vicem, seque sacramento non in scelus aliquod obstringere, sed ne furta, ne latrocinia, ne adulteria comiterent, ne fidem falerent, ne depositum ad pellate abnegarent. Quibus per actis morem sibe discedende fuisse, rorsusque coiundi ad capiendam cibum, promiscuum tamen erinoxium, quod ipsum facere decisse poste dictum meum, quo secundum mandata tua hetaerias esse veteram. Quo mages necessarium credidi, ex duobus angelis quae ministrae dicebantur, quides et veri, et per tormenta quaerere. Nil aliud inveni, quam superstitionem pravam et immodicam.
Others, named by an informer, said that they were Christians and then denied it. They said that they'd in fact been Christians but had given it up, some 3 years before, some more years earlier than that, and a few even 20 years ago. All these also paid homage to your image and to the statues of the gods and cursed Christ. They maintained, however, that this was the sum of their guilt or error, that they'd been in the habit of gathering together on a fixed day before dawn, and of singing antiphonally a hymn to Christ as if to a god, and of binding themselves by oath, not to some wickedness, but not to commit acts of theft or robbery or adultery, not to falsify a trust, nor to refuse to return a deposit when called on to do so. When these ceremonies had been completed, they said it had been their custom to disperse and to meet again to take food, but ordinary and harmless food. They said that they'd given up doing even this after my edict in which, in accordance with your instructions, I'd banned hetaerias. So I believed it to be all the more necessary to ascertain what the truth was from 2 slave women who were called deaconesses and under torture. I found nothing other than a depraved and extravagant superstition. End quote. Red card. Peculiarities of style. Listen to what I'm going to tell you now. When you stare at Pliny's letter to Trajan long enough, you start to see some strange things. Like, for example, we learn that the author's favorite number is 3, because Pliny asks 3 questions to Trajan: whether age matters in the trials, whether repentance is sufficient, whether the name itself should be punished. Pliny encounters 3 types of Christians: confessors, deniers, apostates. And these 3 Christians are accused in 3 different ways: delation, libellus, index. Pliny asks the confessors whether they're Christians 3 times. Pliny has the deniers perform 3 acts: invoke the gods, offer wine and incense, curse Christ. The apostates give 3 different time durations for when they gave up their faith, one of which is 3 years. The apostates did 3 things during their dawn meetings: sing to Christ, bind themselves with an oath, and disperse and come back again to take harmless food. In the oath that's sworn by the apostates, they're forbidden from doing 5 things, but when those 5 things are listed, it's in the form of 3 commands: don't commit, don't falsify, don't refuse. Pliny says that the Romans are threatened by Christianity in 3 ways: age, class, sex. Pliny says that the contagion of Christianity has spread to 3 places: towns, villages, farms. But Pliny is optimistic that Christianity might still be stopped, and for this he gives 3 pieces of evidence. The temples are back online, the customary rites are being renewed, and the animal victims are being sold again. And lastly, Trajan gives 3 directives to Pliny. Don't seek them out. If prosecuted, they should be punished. And anonymous pamphlets ought not to have any place. Well, I said that this letter was forged by a Christian, but what would attract a Christian to the number 3? Cough, cough, Trinity, cough, cough. I don't know. That's what I wrote down in my notes. I see what I get. I was doing like a thing. Okay. Trinity. But I mean, even if this use of 12 groups of 3 is not necessarily meant to invoke the Trinity, this letter is way too short for there to be a valid excuse for this. The only counterargument that I would entertain is that this letter was edited prior to publication, heavily. But there's no evidence of that, no textual evidence that Pliny cleaned up the letters in Book 10 to make them more literary before publication. And added to which, if we are to believe that someone worked over this text to such a degree to artistically paint this beautiful word picture with these carefully crafted groups of 3, then it creates questions as to what the hell the text originally said. And make no mistake, this is not one of those documents that the theologians are content to summarize. They pore over every single word of this thing and perform exegesis on it because it's a massive source for early Christianity. But let's also posit, for the sake of argument, that Pliny did write this letter and that Christianity was the world-denying threat that he claims that it was. In that case, it's interesting that he took the time to create a word painting with this letter instead of scrawling it on the side of a pigeon and sending it flying off to Trajan right that second. I mean, don't even bother writing a message and tying it to the pigeon's hands. Just write it on the actual pigeon. No time to lose. Now, when I noticed this thing about the groups of 3, I basically posted it everywhere, and I got a response from an apologist. And you'll never believe what this cat said. It was on the Bible Geek listeners page. He said, Pliny is simply using the folkloric rule of 3. You know, like how in fairy tales, certain things are grouped in 3s. And it's like, this is the typical response to any problem in any ancient book having to do with Christianity. If there's something weird in it, just claim that it's an example of ancient storytelling or ancient rhetoric and move on, because by saying that, you hope to intimidate the opponent because they're like, well, I thought I was on the right track in criticizing this Christian document, but now it turns out that I guess I have to go get like a master's degree in literature to really comprehend it. But if you're looking for evidence that this Pliny letter is a literary creation, it is here. And the forger clearly had a lot of time on his hands, very much misemploying his leisure time here. Moving on. Our cup runneth over with red cards, and we bestow another one upon Pliny for the persecution trope. We talked about this last time. When he encounters the Christians, it's in 3 distinct groups: the confessors, the deniers, and the apostates. And so we've covered this, and we talked about imagining Pliny making his way through a video game, Pliny's Nightmare, and these 3 groups of Christians and their 3 distinct accusation types are like 3 individual mini-bosses that he encounters and has to figure out how to beat each one. Well, now we've encountered the 3rd and final mini-boss, the apostates. And these are former Christians who have left the faith well before Pliny began his investigation. And they have their own unique accusation type, an informer or index in Latin. Now, Pliny, in fighting this mini-boss, commits the classic mistake that a lot of video game players make. He uses the lessons he learned from the last mini-boss and applies it to this one. In this case, back when he was facing down the deniers, he ingeniously developed a special test procedure to get them to offer libations to the gods and deny their faith. He tries it again on the apostates, but it's not as effective. Yes, he gets them to deny Christ, but he gets the sense that this isn't really the right solution. Pliny is tired of all the killing. He's tired of pouring out wine by the boatload to give to the deniers so that they can offer it to the gods. It's time for him to take a rest. And at this point in his labors, he actually has occasion to talk to the Christians and learn more about them. And he finds out that the real way to tackle this problem is not to look at what the Christians are doing, but to look within himself. In other words, when he's facing this mini-boss, Pliny learns that he and the Roman Empire are actually the real mini-boss. And if that sounds a bit confusing, I'll no doubt clear it up once I issue this next red card. And the red card is for peculiarities of the situation. It's one of the strangest things about this letter, and it's going to provide us with a major clue as to the forger's intent. Let's review the scenario up to this point. Pliny killed the confessors. He put the deniers to the test. He also now puts the apostates to the test. But now he's somehow suddenly interested in what Christians believe and what they do. Did he not think to inquire about this from the confessors or the deniers? I mean, I guess he couldn't ask the confessors what Christians believe since he was so busy waxing the shit out of them. But certainly the deniers. On their way out the door from offering the libations, he could have said, hey, before you go, since I know you have nothing scheduled at the moment, why don't you come back and chat for a minute? I want to get to the bottom of this belief system. I know you don't profess it. That much is clear. But think about helping me as part of your penance, so to speak. And remember, up until that point, other than the brief comment about how no true Christians would ever curse Christ, Pliny hadn't mentioned any Christian beliefs or practices at all. Now, by the logic of this letter and what Pliny is supposedly trying to do with it, which is basically to get Trajan to approve his sacrifice test, the letter could have ended after he let the deniers go free. He could have still said the stupid thing about how the temples were all bankrupt and ended the letter asking for Trajan's advice. He didn't need to take us or Trajan on a journey where he talks about how the lapsed Christians instructed him in the wisdom of their ways, like Pocahontas lecturing John Smith. I mean, Pliny was pretty much done at this point. I killed half of them. I let half of them go. I'm not sure if it was right to let that half of them go, so please clarify. But you see, if the letter ended there, we wouldn't get the opportunity to learn about how peaceable and innocent the Christians were. I mean, this further investigation doesn't help Pliny's argument to Trajan in the slightest. In fact, it severely detracts from it in every possible sense. But to us, the readers, and to the audience of early Christians like Tertullian, who were the primary consumers of this forgery, this is really the only chance that the forger has to drive home as much Christian apologetic as he can in order to appeal to them. He's going to drill that Christian apologetic through the reader's head like Anton Chigurh with that cattle gun. So the forger has Pliny pause the trials at this point and conduct the investigation so that he can have a chance to whack in all his pro-Christian propaganda, because otherwise he has no place to put it. And speaking of, we got another red card for Pliny the Younger's ass. Low-key Christian propaganda when he reports that the apostate Christians did nothing wrong. And this also happens to be a red card for intertextuality, so 2 in 1. The critic Neil Godfrey pointed out some interesting parallels between Pliny's statements here to some famous New Testament phrases. Pontius Pilate in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark asked the crowd what evil Jesus committed. He found no evidence of any crime. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, he says, "You brought this man to me as someone who's turning away the people. And look, I, after I examined him before your face, found nothing criminal in this man of what you're accusing against him. Not even Herod did, because he sent him up to us. And look, nothing worthy of death is having been acted by him." There's nothing I love more than reading the Gospels literally word for word instead of those translations that deliberately try to make them sound more august. Lastly, the Gospel of John. Pilate says to them, "You take him and you crucify him, because I'm not finding a cause of incrimination in him." The received Christian literary device was that Christians are innocent no matter what. It's interesting that when Justin, Minucius, Athenagoras, Tertullus, all these people say that the Romans accused Christians of monstrous, unspeakable crimes, but they never even so much as slightly concede that some Christians somewhere could be guilty of those crimes. They don't even take the law of averages into account. No, to them, true Christians might be accused of anything you can conjure up, but they're never guilty of anything. In fact, the more you accuse them of, the less likely they are to be guilty. And that is a doctrinal position. It is a belief that is spelled out clearly in Pliny's letter, Paul's letters, the John letters, the Shepherd of Hermas, the letter of James. By the way, did you notice, and I've pointed this out once before, Pliny's letter has the same exact problem that the Gospels do. Because in the Gospels, exactly what crime is Jesus being charged with? I once read an article that talked about how a team of modern lawyers analyzed the Gospels, and they concluded that whatever happened at Jesus' trial, it was a miscarriage of justice. That much is clear, they said. And that's great, but exactly where and when did these lawyers think that these trials took place? They didn't take place in Bible land during the Bible time period. They took place in the Roman Empire, which, whatever could be said about it, was fairly obsessed with procedure. Generations of Romans made their names by arguing cases at law. It was practically their national pastime. But in the New Testament and in Pliny's letter, everything is suddenly ad hoc. But what the forger was doing here was, of course, adapting the received Christian literary device. Whatever happened with Christians in the trials that Pliny was conducting against them, they were innocent. And the story, or the through line of this letter, is actually Pliny recognizing their inherent innocence. And that inherent innocence, by the way, is one of the trademarks of the fake Tacitus passage about Christians in Annals Book 15 as well. It's one of the telltale signs of Christian fabrication. So 2 red cards here. Pliny's in trouble. Moving on. Just a quick hit here, a red card for peculiarities of the situation. Were there no heretics in Bithynia? If you read the writings of the 2nd century theologians, they're finding a heretic around every corner. They're like Grandpa Simpson when he kept seeing death everywhere. But the apostate Christians that are brought in by Pliny are just a faithful, homogeneous band of brothers. They all met together. They all had meals together. They don't ever intimate that, hey, that codger around the block calls himself a Christian, but he ain't really a Christian. He's one of them jag-off Nicolaitans. And if we accept that the book of Revelation is genuine and early, it was also written in Asia Minor about 15 years before this, and that writer appears to envision himself as surrounded by heretics. Think about those letters in the book of Revelation for a minute. This guy, the author, has the opportunity to have Jesus write letters to 7 churches, could have him say literally anything, could reveal some cool stuff about heaven, for example. Instead, 75% of what he writes about is the bog standard 2nd century Christian griping about those damn heretics. Would Jesus not have something more important to talk about? Walter Bauer, the great theologian, I would almost call him a radical. In his famous study of orthodoxy and heresy in earliest Christianity, he essentially said that you'd be hard-pressed to find a single Orthodox Christian east of the Sangarius River. Well, in Pliny's letter, the Christians are hanging out in perfect solidarity, almost as if it's a golden age of some kind, and it probably would have been to a forger writing 80 years later. At least he takes the opportunity to portray it as such. Now, I've been saying in this series that the forger very much had heretics in mind in all this, and I think that his way of dealing with heretics is to imply that those were the Christians who denied their religion outright. After all, as I've said, that was the common belief of the Christians in the late 100s. Heretics are always ready to deny Christ for a hot dog and a soda. And in real life, he's concerned with this idea that a mass persecution could envelop heretics and then continue to intensify and spread to him and his brethren. So his very object in forging Pliny's letter is to have the Roman state offer an out to the heretics. Let them deny their faith like they always do, and then let's all forget about the whole thing and certainly don't start arresting real Christians. Moving on. We now issue a major red card to Pliny, and it's one that we haven't really used up until now, but it's a big one. Lack of incidence of Christianity. When Pliny interviews the apostate Christians, they tell him that some of them have long since given up the faith, some as many as 20 years earlier. And that would have been around 90 AD. So this means that there were people calling themselves Christians in Bithynia and Pontus by that early date, and there were enough of them to cause problems for Pliny by the year 110. In fact, Bithynia is represented by Pliny as being absolutely teeming with Christians. You got the Christians who gave up the faith 3 years ago, some a few years earlier than that, some 20 years ago, and then you have the anonymous pamphlet with many names of Christians on it. And let's of course not forget about the Christians who admitted to their faith, of whom there were enough Roman citizens in that group for Pliny to make a special mention of it.
Now, first of all, this looks unlikely just on its face. It reminds us very much about what the fake Tacitus said in the forged passage from the Annals about there being an immense multitude of Christians in Rome in the 60s AD. And we talked about the Christian apologist of the late 100s AD, always emphasizing that Christianity was spreading everywhere, right under the noses of the Romans, in every city and throughout the provinces. There's no nation on earth that's not Christian. Crowds of people are passing over daily from you to us. And the forger of Pliny's letter is using that trope as well. In fact, if you were to read this letter knowing nothing else about Christianity, this actually sounds like it's all taking place in like a colonial province where Christianity is the mass religion of the locals, but it's not the religion of the colonial administrators. You know, it'd be like if the British Empire had outlawed Hinduism in India, and we had a letter from some colonial official who now realizes that the entire population of his province is secretly practicing it. That's what it sounds like. It doesn't sound at all like this is some obscure sect that only a tiny portion of the population in Bithynia and Pontus belong to. Now, the Pliny expert Wynne Williams did a fairly good overview of Bithynia and Pontus in his commentary on the letters. Bithynia is named after its original people, the Bithynioi, who maintained their independence from Alexander and his successors. Eventually, one of their kings bequeathed the entire nation to the Romans in his will, and Pontus, which is the coast of northern Turkey, was another independent nation originally, ruled by a family of Iranian descent who eventually waged war against the Romans in some spectacular conflicts. By the end of these, the Romans prevailed, and they came to rule all of northern Anatolia. And they combined Bithynia and Pontus into a single province, and they would remain united until the rule of Diocletian in the 4th century. It was actually the Roman general Pompey who had presided over the final Roman victory in the wars, and so he had the authority to organize the province. And the result was that most of Bithynia in the time of Pliny fell under what was called the Constitution of Pompey, and this was the law code that he had devised and imposed on the region. Kind of like how FDR wrote the Constitution of Haiti at his desk in the Navy Department while smoking a cigar. Well, the reality was that laws differed from city to city in Bithynia. Some cities were self-governing, some were exempt from direct tax, others weren't. Some cities had what were called the Italian rights, which meant that for legal purposes, they were treated as if they were part of Italy and entitled to the same privilege. I once worked for an airline, but the planes were under lease, and figuring out who actually owned them was a Herculean endeavor. I remember one time my boss, who was the Scottish guy, said, "What, did they make these deals in the fucking alcoholics clinic?" That would also aptly describe the legal system of these Bithynian cities, and by the way, the variations between the various local laws comes up a lot in Book 10 of Pliny's letters, like a whole lot. Doesn't come up at all in the Christian's letter. I'm just pointing that out. So yellow card for that. But if the events described in the Christian letter really happened, they had to have occurred either in the city of Amisos or Amastris. Although, like I've said, those cities are 300 miles away from each other. But that's where Pliny was located before and after the Christian letter was supposedly written. Now, Amisos was an ancient Greek colony that was made into a free city by Julius Caesar. Actually, its title was a free and allied city. It was not actually free nor allied. It was actually part of the empire. The free and allied part was just an honorific, kind of like making the div kid at school milk monitor, as Gareth said. Well, the Romans had a habit of doing this kind of thing throughout the world. If you didn't object to their conquest, you were considered free. But it was free with like 18 footnotes after it. But Pliny in letter 93 reminds us that the city of Amisos did technically have its own laws that applied only to it. And this is a state of affairs that probably would have been relevant if these trials of Christians came up when Pliny was spending time there. So the fact that he doesn't bring it up could be an indication that the trials didn't take place there. And shortly after the Christian's letter, Pliny writes from Amastris, which was just a bog standard city. Both of these towns still exist today, by the way, in modern Turkey, but both of these cities were in Pontus. Now, Pontus had the reputation of being somewhat of a backwater, and this is what Tertullian says about it nearly a century later, quote, "The fiercest nations inhabit it, if it can actually be called habitation when you live your life in a wagon. They have no fixed abode. Their life has no germ of civilization. They indulge their libidinous desires without restraint and for the most part, naked. We see some exaggeration here, but as with anything in ancient writings, you have to remember that the criticism or the joke has to have made sense in some way to the audience for someone to write stuff like this. You know, like if Pontus had a bullet train and neon signs everywhere, it wouldn't have been effective rhetoric for someone to make fun of them for living naked in wagons. So when it comes to Pontus, we see that if there was a bright center of the Roman Empire, we're in a province that's reasonably far from it. Could this many Christians have existed in this place and in this time in the year 110 AD? For that, we have to talk somewhat now about the spread of earliest Christianity. For this, I'm going to draw on the critical scholar Richard Carrier's arguments from his book, Not the Impossible Faith, where he talks about this. And I chose him because in his analysis, he also surveys a lot of the work that's been done by others in calculating the increase in the amount of Christians from decade to decade, from its earliest beginnings all the way up until the year 300. And these are people like Rodney Stark, Robin Lane Fox, Bruce Molina, William B. Harris, Jack Sanders, Thomas Finn. Essentially, at the turn of the 4th century, we can estimate that there were about 6 million Christians in the entire world. And the sociologist Rodney Stark calculated that there would have had to have been about a 40% growth rate per decade to achieve this number, which, by the way, may be somewhat on the high end in terms of estimates. But extrapolating backwards from this, that would mean that in the year 110, there were no more than about 10,000 Christians on Earth, and most of them were concentrated in cities. And when we think about the distributions of these Christians in the year 110, where they would have lived, we shouldn't expect them to have been distributed perfectly evenly. They were more prominent in some places than in others. And estimating ancient populations is notoriously difficult, but based on the work done by Bruce Fryer on the demographics of the Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries, I've estimated that the population of the Eastern Empire in 110 AD contained about 56% of the population of the empire. I said it was my estimate because he's given the totals for 14 AD and 164 AD, so one has to extrapolate the 110 AD number, which is the time that Pliny supposedly wrote his letter. But what that means is that in the entire Greek East, there were likely no more than 5,600 Christians to go around in the time of Pliny. And then you consider how many Christians lived in the biggest cities, Alexandria, Antioch, Corinth, Ephesus. Even if you assume congregations of about 500 Christians each for these cities in the time of Pliny, it soon becomes clear that there aren't enough Christians to go around, and not enough to sufficiently populate this backwater of Pontus in the year 110. And as Richard Carrier also points out when discussing Rodney Stark's analysis, this rate of growth matches what we know of the growth of similar smaller cults in the empire, which is not much, but certainly nothing that we know of really strongly conflicts with Stark's findings. Now, if you notice, everything I've just said about the calculation of Christianity's growth rate still assumes that Christianity originated in the 30s AD. Because what we did here was use the conventional paradigm's own numbers against it for demonstration purposes. In other words, even if you assume that Christianity began early, your own numbers regarding its spread and growth make such a situation as described in Pliny's letter impossible. There wouldn't have been enough Christians in the world, let alone enough Christians in this specific place, to produce the kind of scenario that Pliny's talking about here. But let's also briefly talk about how this would work under my own theory of Christian origins. If there were 6 million Christians in the year 300, and if the rate of growth was 40% per decade, what implications does that have for born in the 2nd century as a whole? Well, as I said in episode 1, and as I later found out that Martin Luther King Jr. actually said in a college paper where he trashed Christian apologists, Christianity did not spring forth fully grown like Minerva from the head of Zeus. It developed out of the Jewish gnosis, and if there were no more than 2,500 Jewish Gnostics anywhere in the world in the year 70 AD that were amenable to these new ideas, then my own model for the rise of Christianity can also account for 6 million Christians by the turn of the 4th century,
even when, as I said, that seems a bit on the high side for estimating the amount of Christians at that time. And Christianity was indeed a tiny sect until well into the 3rd century, such that Origen can say in the 240s that, quote, only a very few are Christians, such that we don't see a reliable pattern of archaeological evidence for Christians until the 3rd century, such that the church in the largest city in the empire can have less than 10,000 parishioners by the year 250. On the subject of archaeology, Richard Carrier also says in his book that only in the 3rd century does material evidence of a Christian presence anywhere in the empire begin to match even that of minor pagan cults. But since we're talking about Richard Carrier, I wanted to say a bit about his overall treatment of Pliny's letter. We've just talked about how he's outlined the growth of Christianity in his book, Not the Impossible Faith, and he agrees with Rodney Stark's conclusions that there weren't many Christians by the time that Pliny supposedly wrote his letter, certainly less than 20,000 in the whole world. But I've been saying throughout this series that Pliny in his letter seems to be describing a vibrant faith with many adherents. His investigations are turning up entire hordes of them. They're tanking the economy. Everyone in the province is in danger. And Carrier believes that Pliny's letter is genuine. So how does he square the fact of the low number of Christians in the year 110 with what Pliny says about them in his letter? Well, Carrier would not agree with me that Pliny's letter actually indicates that Christians were very numerous in Bithynia, because he views every instance of Pliny freaking out about the advance of Christianity as an example of, take a shot, ancient rhetorical techniques. He says that the Christians couldn't have been that numerous since Pliny doesn't know anything about them, never attended their trials. He points out that Pliny had been governor for over a year before even learning that there were Christians in his province, which the letter actually doesn't suggest that. In fact, as I pointed out in episode 13, Pliny never reveals how and when he became aware of Christians. But anyway, Carrier also says that Pliny's complaints about the temples being deserted and no one buying sacrificial animals is classic rhetorical flourish. And this is an example of what I've been pointing out throughout this series about those who believe that Pliny's letter is genuine, yet recognize these massive intractable problems and contradictions within it, and they don't want to argue that it's inauthentic, so they come up with ways to explain these problems away. And they usually do this by saying that anything in this letter that doesn't fit their theory is an example of classical rhetoric. But in this case, the letter being inauthentic explains all the concerns that Carrier raised. First of all, the forger assumes that there were plenty of Christians in Bithynia because there were plenty of Christians in his time. On my model, there would have been about 160,000 Christians in the world in the year 190 when I'm saying this letter was forged. Pliny not knowing about Christians is necessary for the forger to make it look like the Romans came up with this idea of light treatment of the Christians all on their own. To the forger, a Pliny who knows nothing about Christians is about as close to an objective third party weighing in on this situation as it's possible to get. The temples being deserted and no one buying sacrificial animals is of course not true whether the letter is genuine or forged, but we can detect a bit of Christian pride in the composition of those lines. It's low-key Christian propaganda, as we'll talk about later. More to the point, it's a reference to Acts of the Apostles, but we conclude here that if the forger didn't realize that the term Christian originated later than he supposed, if he didn't recognize that Christianity split from Judaism later than supposed, then he didn't have a fighting chance of recognizing that Bithynia would not have been jam-packed with Christians in 112 AD, and that explains why he seems to suggest that it was. We can explain it that way without resorting to these ideas that everything that looks weird is just an example of rhetoric. And I just want to say something quickly here on that subject, and this is going to be controversial, but I sometimes think that some historians try to claim that Romans and Greeks wrote in a way that made sense to them but is barely penetrable to us to kind of justify their own credentials as historians. I don't know. I mean, if you read ancient literature and know somewhat about the time period, the literature and the poetry is not indecipherable. In fact, for the 2nd century in particular, if you read books by Lucian and Apuleius, for example, or even those Hellenistic romances by Xenophon and others, at times they actually read like modern writers. And this idea that you have to go to school for 6 years to know how to read a Roman letter,
I don't know, it's suspicious to me. Added to which, yes, the Roman authors were trained in rhetoric, but to some extent, actually to a great extent in my opinion, the ability to understand and recognize Aristotelian rhetoric is kind of embedded within us when we pursue an education of any kind, whether it's self-taught or formal, because logically, our cultures have absorbed and incorporated that rhetoric. Some speechwriters today or some polemicists may be using these ancient rhetorical tools without even realizing that they're doing it. So I don't know. When I read these commentaries, I never get the sense that I'm out of my league. The only thing that ever occurs to me that might be an issue is that a lot of these professionals have just read a lot more books and papers than me. And that's something that I try to rectify over time, but it's a process. Now, one more thing on this passage from Pliny's letter. Some might argue that Pliny may have discovered this giant nest of Christians in the city of Sinope on the northern coast. It was an ancient city that had become a Roman colony with the Italian rights, and Sinope is conveniently located right between the cities of Amastris and Amisos, the places from which Pliny is writing on either side of the Christian's letter. In fact, it's almost halfway between the two. Just as an aside, at this point in this series, I'm more familiar with the map of Roman Anatolia than I am of the map of my own neighborhood, and that is by no means an exaggeration. I only recently moved here. But more to the point, Sinope was where the great heretic Marcion supposedly hailed from, and he allegedly came to prominence in the 140s AD. So there's therefore some indication that there could have been Christians in Sinope in the early 2nd century, given that it could produce a heretic like Marcion a generation later. Well, here's what Pliny himself had to say about Sinope in letter 90, quote, "The town of Sinope, sir, is in need of a water supply. I think there's plenty of good water that could be brought from a source 16 miles away, but there's a doubtful area of marshy ground stretching for more than a mile from the spring." End quote. Is he not worried about Christian VC attacking his supply lines in Sinope? He gives no indication about there being Christians there, and that's important because even today, in scholarly treatments of Marcion, it's often assumed that he was the son of a local bishop there because that's also what the later Christians reported about him. Well, it would have been nice if Pliny had set his Christian tale in Sinope because that would have tied everything up in a nice, neat bow, but he didn't. And from letter 90, as we said, there's in fact a suggestion that the Christian trials did not occur there. As I said, Pliny's letter about Christians was originally a standalone composition that happened to be placed here in this Amisos Amastris section for specific reasons. Back after this. Now we get to the part of Pliny's letter where he, for whatever reason, decides to take us on a curated tour of Christian ceremony in the 1st century AD. He'd have been better advised not to do this because, as we'll see, he's creating a world of red cards for himself. Pliny says that the Christians met on a fixed day before dawn, singing an antiphonal hymn to Christ, swearing an oath not to commit acts of wickedness, and dispersing and meeting again to take ordinary and harmless food. Now, the first thing I want to do is to remind you of something I said last time. With any of these texts that are forged by Christians like Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny, Josephus, the Christians who are forging these texts are doing so decades or centuries later. And they're not in a position to know what the Christians of that early time were really like. So what they end up doing is extrapolating the behavior of what they know as Orthodox Christians in their time and projecting it into the past and relying on earlier sources when necessary. That's why when you read a genuine Roman testimony about Christians like that of Lucian or Celsus, we learn a lot more about how Christians actually behaved than we do in these Christian forgeries like Tacitus and Suetonius. Remember back to the first ever reading on this show, episode 1,
Celsus talked about Christian missionaries buttonholing slaves at the washerwoman's shop. He talked about Christian priests using plants and minerals and demonic invocations in their healing. Lucian portrays the Christians as a gaggle of annoying rubes, but in Pliny, Tacitus, Suetonius, Josephus, all we ever see is that the Christians are innocent, well-behaved, always submitting willingly to martyrdom, and they have no beliefs or behaviors outside of the norm, except for the fact that the mob and often the Roman author himself have this weird, unexplained hatred towards them. And we see this here as well. The forger of Pliny's letter is not in a position to know what Christians said or did in 112 AD. But he needs to have them demonstrate to Pliny that they're not doing anything wrong to carry forward the Christian apologetic and make Pliny realize that they're really innocent so that he can set the table for Trajan's response prescribing light treatment. So the way the forger chooses to accomplish this is to give us a window onto the Christian ceremonies of the time, of which he knows jack shit of what those were or what they would have looked like. And according to him, their service consists of prayers, hymns, an oath, and a meal. All of these elements show up in one form or another in the writings of Justin Martyr and of Tertullian. The earliest record of Christian ceremonies can be found in the First Apology by Justin, and he says that the Christians meet on Sunday, conduct a reading, listen to an exhortation, pray together, and have a meal. Justin also says that Christians pledge themselves to do no wickedness. So it's not that different from Pliny's account, which is supposed to be from about 40 years before Justin. Now, what about the hymn? Well, I quote from Tertullian's Apology book from like the year 200 when he talks about the Christian meal service. He says that after it, each person is asked to stand forth and sing, if he can, a hymn to God, either one from the Holy Scriptures or one of his own composing. And then he says that the meal ends with prayer, and that the Christians go forth not like troops of mischief makers or bands of vagabonds, nor to break out in licentious acts. In his time, the meal ceremony is a pious and solemn religious service, just as it is in Pliny's letter. And in his book De Corona, Tertullian says that the congregations meet before daybreak, just as in Pliny's letter, and they take bread from the hand of the church president, which the Lord commanded to be eaten at meal times. And as far as oaths, Tertullian is big on oaths being part of Christian services, but he talks about it in the context of public confession, almost like Marxist self-criticism. For him, it's a big part of what Christianity is all about, forswearing sin and making a public acknowledgement of such. Other Christian sources like the Didache also support this. They say that Christians should confess their sins prior to their common meal. Now, Tertullian says that all this came from custom that flowed from tradition. That's by way of his acknowledging outright that a lot of that stuff isn't in the New Testament. And I want us to perform a thought exercise here. Let's imagine that we believe in the traditional timeline of Christian origins, that the New Testament books were written in the 1st century, that Pliny's letter is genuine, and that Tertullian, of course, wrote at the turn of the 3rd century. And also, let's assume that the New Testament does not reflect an advanced view of church order and church procedure. I think that it actually does in places, but you have to read between the lines. But given these assumptions, how much sense does it make that the ceremony that Pliny is describing here far more closely matches what Christians were doing in the year 200 than what the New Testament appears to suggest they were doing in the 1st century? Again, this is one of those scenarios where we have to imagine that the Christians were caught in a closed time loop for this letter to make sense. Now, as I said, I think that the New Testament, especially Acts, does suggest an advanced church order, but even still, the majority of the New Testament books were still written prior to the major period of development of Christian church practice that took place from the 160s to the 180s, according to my timeline. And that was the time period in which the mainstream church began to absorb the Pauline church. But much more importantly, they were in the midst of a war with the great Montanist heresy. And that was the time period where, in fighting against the Montanists, who were the first to have salaried clergy members, the mainstream church began organizing itself on more regimented lines. And the substance and procedure of their ceremony began to fall into place and became more formal. And by the mid-3rd century, They're to the point where they're talking about deacons having to stand at the door like a Walmart greeter. Well, what we see here in Pliny's letter is the church procedure of the late 100s being projected back into the early 100s. And note also something key, something that's rarely brought up. Pliny learns about these church ceremonies not by observing them, but by listening to testimony from the apostate Christians who also say that some of them were doing these things 20 years earlier. So we have to imagine not only that these things could have been taking place in 112 AD, but also in 92 AD as well. How much worse can this anachronism get? So we issue 2 red cards to Pliny here, one for anachronism, as I just said, and also one for intertextuality, because the substance of this ceremony appears to be drawn from Christian commentaries of the late 100s. The forger had a unique challenge here. He had to portray the Christians as innocent and had a number of ways of doing that, and what he chose was to have them outline their innocent routine in their weekly meetings. And for that, he created a somewhat simplified form of the routine that he was familiar with and projected it into the past. And the next few red cards that we'll be discussing are also part of this technique, so we'll need to keep it in mind. Moving on. The hand strikes and gives a red card for anachronism. We have to talk about this thing that Pliny says about the former Christians saying that in their meetings they would sing to Christ as to a god. Carmen Christo quasi Deo dicere. This is one of the passages that Christ mythicists, those who believe that Jesus was not a historical figure, love to spend time on for some reason. I wish I loved anything as much as Christ mythicists love talking about Carmenque Christo quasi Deo dicere, because they're trying to argue that Pliny is not a reliable witness for the existence of Jesus, and they read this passage as him implying that the Christians were worshiping a fully divine being and not a divine being that was based ultimately on a mortal man who lived in history. But what's actually important for our purposes is the cagey language that the author is using. Before we get into that, it's important to discuss another difference between what this letter says in modern editions and what Tertullian said was in it in his supposed use of it. And we didn't talk about this in episode 10. I actually did record something about it, but I ended up cutting it out to save the discussion for this episode. Tertullian says that in the version of Pliny's letter that he read, the Christians told Pliny that they sang to Christ and to God. And that was the reading that I went with when I read the Tertullian passage in episode 10, but that is not actually the appropriate reading. As Earl Doherty points out in his book, Jesus Neither God Nor Man, the reading in some manuscripts of Tertullian's Apology reads Christ as to God or Christ as if to a God. In other words, Christ and to God was not what Tertullian originally wrote. And that's confirmed by the fact that brother of the show, Eusebius, who makes a big deal about how he's translated this Tertullian passage all by himself, when he translates this part, he says, ton Christon theodikein, Christ in the manner of God. And Jerome also says something similar. So Pliny's letter as we have it faithfully reflects what it originally said, no matter when it was written or by whom. They sang to Christ as to a God. Now, there was a common belief in the late 2nd century that the Father and the Son were essentially interchangeable. There's modalism, and there's some evidence of that even in some New Testament writings like Jude and Titus that refer to God as the Savior, for example. I would put those shortly after 150 AD. Second Clement from the same time period begins with the words, "It's fitting that you should think of Jesus Christ as of God." The letters of Ignatius, which I date to the 170s, refer to Jesus Christ our God. Irenaeus says, Christ himself is the God of the living who spoke to Moses and was manifested to the fathers. Justin says that the Son, being the first begotten Word of God, is God. Now, some of these are not actually modalist beliefs because the authors also believe in the Trinity, but they're trying to convey that Jesus Christ shouldn't be seen as less than God. It's a fine distinction, which they themselves clearly don't even understand half the time. That's the thing about these ancient theology and Trinity debates. You have to always keep in mind that these writers were not all geniuses. Half the time, they don't even understand their own material. I always say that a so-called educated Christian in the 2nd century is kind of like a modern white-collar worker with a 20-year gap in his resume that he can't explain. But Justin, for example, says at one point that Jesus is technically God, but then he says elsewhere that, well, he's the second power after God. And this, of course, gets into the debates over the Trinity, which we obviously don't have time for today. But the Trinitarian controversy was a massive one for the early mainstream church because it hit close to home for them. The oneness of God was one of their defining traits as a sect. And it would be Tertullian's famous treatise Against Praxeas that would establish the outlines of what the Catholic Church came to believe on this subject. But as we see, even in this early period, they're already heavily interested in exploring the relationship between Christ and God. Pliny's Christians, too, appear keen to explore this relationship. Now, of course, Pliny is speaking about these things in almost pagan terms because the forger was trying to replicate what a pagan would say. But would it have killed him to just say, they sang hymns to Christ? No, it has to be, they sang hymns to Christ as to a god. The forger, like every Catholic fabricator from the first few centuries, was trying to telegraph that this small community of early Christians shared his own orthodox beliefs. And one of those beliefs was in the divinity of Christ and his identification in some way with God, even if the forger himself wouldn't have been clear on the specifics of that. Saying that they worshiped Christ would have been suspect. Saying that they worshiped Jesus would certainly have been suspect. Saying that they worshiped God wouldn't have been sufficient, but saying that they worshiped Christ as God or Christ as to a god would have covered the basis for this thing to be appropriately orthodox. And even the stickler Eusebius had no problem with that language in Pliny's letter, even though God knows he had his own weird issues with the Trinity. But moving on. We can talk now about the various red cards that we want to issue to Pliny for what he says about the oath that the Christians swore in their meetings. And I talked earlier about how Tertullian mentions an oath as being part of Christian services. Justin also mentions one. And certainly with the way Tertullian talks about the meal service being a solemn religious affair, and they all go forth from it not as sinners, nor to commit licentious acts, and they prayed throughout the ceremony, it would suggest that an oath, possibly also involving confession of sins, was involved with the Christian meal service in his time. Now, Pliny, when talking about the oath, calls it a sacrament. And there's been a big war going on among the theologians over whether the term sacrament here means a general oath or whether it refers to an official Christian sacrament like in the Catholic Mass. And I actually don't feel like getting into it because I don't think it matters that much. What I want to look at is the substance of the oath. But just as an aside, sacrament is one of Tertullian's favorite words, and he, writing around the year 200, explicitly uses it in its modern sense of being a Christian ritual. Now, according to Pliny, the oath was not to commit acts of theft or robbery or adultery, not to falsify a trust, nor to refuse to return a deposit. Now, on those last two, basically in the Roman world, everyday people obviously did not have access to Wells Fargo, so they sometimes would deposit money or property with a trusted friend or neighbor. And it was a reality that in at least some cases, when they came calling to get their money back, the person who'd taken it for safekeeping would say, "What name so?" And the Christians are swearing an oath here that if they take money from someone else for safekeeping, they can always be relied upon to do the right thing and return it to its owner. Now, I quote from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. "The will of God is that you abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you knows how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, and not in passion of lust, like the Gentiles who don't know God, and that no one violates the rights and takes advantage of his brother or sister in the matter." I also quote from Justin Martyr's second apology. "Why have you punished this man, not as an adulterer nor fornicator, nor murderer, nor thief, nor robber, nor convicted of any crime at all, but who's only confessed that he's called by the name of Christian?" In both of these passages, the sin of adultery is in very close proximity to the sin not only of theft, but of fraud, like business fraud. They're placed right next to each other. And some have pointed out that this oath that the Christians swear in Pliny's letter has some connection to the 10 Commandments, but really Commandments 7 and 8. You shall not commit adultery, which is immediately followed by you shall not steal. What seems to have happened was that Christians developed an ethic in the 2nd century that expanded on the 10 Commandments, And we see that in the First Thessalonians passage and the Justin passage, where they no longer simply say, don't commit adultery, don't steal. Now it's become, don't commit adultery because A, B, C, D, E, and also don't steal, such as in scenarios X, Y, and Z. And in Pliny's letter, for all its brevity, we actually see a more advanced version of this than we do in Justin and in 1 Thessalonians, at least when it comes to the fraud section. In Pliny's letter, they've expanded so much on you shall not steal that it's now don't commit robbery, don't falsify a trust, don't refuse to return a deposit when called on to do so. This elaborate Christian commentary on the Ten Commandments makes much more sense as coming from the end of the 2nd century than from the beginning of the 2nd century. So it's a red card for mere anachronism, but also we see some intertextuality with that passage in 1 Thessalonians, so we'll also issue a red card for that. And you know how I learned about the connection between these passages? From Sherwin-White's commentary. And when I read him saying that, I was like, that was a freebie. Of course, he puts 1 Thessalonians in like the 40s AD, but we spent 2 episodes on it and I placed it at 105. But even still, this specific passage in 1 Thessalonians with the catalog of sins comes from the pastoral stratum of the letter, which was added after 150 at least. Now, I mentioned in episode 10 that when Tertullian gives his whack-ass citation of Pliny's letter, the substance of the oath is different from what we see in our modern editions of Pliny. Pliny says it was adultery, robbery, not falsifying a trust, not refusing to return a deposit. Whereas Tertullian says it was murder, adultery, fraud, treachery, and what he calls other crimes. We're going to discuss this again next time in the Pliny series finale, and it's going to actually be yet another clear indication that this letter was not originally part of Book 10. Moving on. Pliny now receives 3 red cards in 1 for his description of the Christian meal service where they get together and eat ordinary and harmless food. First of all, red card for style. Ordinary and harmless as opposed to what? Prions? Trans fats? It's a strange thing to say in and of itself. Remember how Trajan refused to allow the locals to set up a fire company? Imagine if they did it anyway, and Pliny was investigating, and he said, one of the things the firemen do is eat a meal together after they put out the fire, but it's ordinary and harmless food. It's like, what, is Pliny a dietitian now? But this weird statement can be explained by issuing another red card for intertextuality. Because ordinary and harmless food presupposes that Christians are accused of eating human flesh, something that the late 2nd century apologists claim is a crime that they're notorious for. Notice here that the forger assumes that the reader will be familiar with those accusations even where Pliny apparently is not. To understand this letter properly, I don't mean in modern times, I mean at the time it was forged, you need to come in with certain backstory about Christianity beforehand. You need to know the persecution trope, one of whose elements is that Christians are accused of what's called Thyestian banquets, where they practice cannibalism. In other words, this is dramatic irony being employed here by the forger. And the third red card here is, of course, for low-key Christian propaganda. Just like in the writings of the Christian apologists of the 100s AD, Pliny feels the need to explain that the Christian's meal service is really the paragon of innocence. In one way or another, all those apologists do the same thing. It's kind of like a weird tick that they have. They always talk about how innocuous their little meal ritual is. If Christianity was such a danger, then Pliny would have been advised to omit the part about how they didn't seem to be doing anything wrong, but again, it's in the forger's interest to depict that the Christians aren't doing anything wrong. And he wants to have Pliny make that same realization. Now, it's generally agreed that Pliny, in talking about the meal service, is referring to what's called the agape, which was a communal meal that the early Christians held. And then there's a debate about whether the Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ, was incorporated into the agape at this early date or whether it was still separate. But the thing is, in the late 2nd century and early 3rd century, the agape was still being held, whether it included the Eucharist or not. And this is a really complicated issue that we don't have time to get into on this episode, but the church manual called the Didache says that the meal is held on the Lord's Day after gathering together and confessing one's sins, and Tertullian says outright in his apology book that the Christians gather for a modest meal. It's called the agape, and it's an act of religious service. The participants pray first, then eat moderately, then they wash their hands, and each person is asked to sing a hymn to God, and they close out with a prayer. And the letters of Ignatius, which I claim also date to this time period, also mention the agape, and they say that you shouldn't practice it without the bishop. The point here in all this is that the Christian meal that's depicted in Pliny's letter somehow does not look any more quote-unquote ancient than the Christian meal service that was happening a full 80 years later. And that's surprising. Think of how much the ritual and liturgy of the church developed between the time of Tertullian and the time of Cyprian, for example. We usually see a steady level of development throughout the history of early Christianity, except in this one weird Philip K. Dick closed time loop of Pliny's letter, where nothing appears to have changed for a century, both in the Christian service and in the Romans' treatment of Christians. And the one thing that's conspicuously missing from this meal account in Pliny, like I said, is whether or not it involved the Eucharist. But we can see from the writings of the Christians in the late 100s that some of them included the Eucharist in the agape meal, and some of them apparently didn't. And eventually, the Eucharist ceremony would replace the agape entirely. But the point is, the forger projects the Christian practices of his time back into the early 2nd century. And he must be aware that not all Christians would eat the body and blood of Christ at the same time as their regular communal meal. So he keeps it safe and doesn't mention it, leaves it implied. And he has a good excuse for doing so in that Pliny, this Roman schmohawk pagan, wouldn't understand the nuances of these things anyway. Moving on. We continue to shower Pliny with a ticker tape parade of red cards. Here's another one for peculiarities of style. Pliny says that the apostate Christians were in the habit of meeting on a fixed day before dawn. So let's talk a bit first about the calendars in the ancient world, the most complicated subject imaginable. The ancient Mesopotamian calendars had 7 days in a week, and that was based on astrological observations. And the Jewish calendar also adopted a 7-day week fairly early, and that was because of the 7-day creation process that God undertook in Genesis. I'm sure that God creating the world in 7 days had nothing to do with the fact that the ancient Mesopotamian calendars already had a 7-day week, but in the Roman Empire, at least officially, a week lasted 8 days. It was a custom inherited from the Etruscans, and there were market days at the end of every week, the nundinae. But during the 1st century, the 7-day planetary week began to catch on more and more in the empire, but it wasn't formalized until the time of Constantine in the 4th century. Now, Pliny's letter says that the Christians met on a fixed day. Justin Martyr in the 150s says outright that the Christian services take place on Sunday. He also says that the Christian services last as time permits, which implies that it took place in the morning, as it does here in Pliny's letter when he says that they met before dawn. Now, the Romans, of course, recognized Sunday. That was one of their days of the week, the dies solis, the day of the sun. Now, why wouldn't Pliny just say, okay, they meet together on Sunday? Well, it could be that the Christian forger was trying to preserve the fiction that Pliny didn't know much about Christianity. Now, here, someone might argue and say, well, why would it be relevant for him to tell Trajan what specific day they held their meetings on? And my response to that would be that he goes out of his way to mention that it's a fixed day. Might as well say what day it is. You're already burning through like 8 sheets of papyrus to write this thing as it is, but it could also be that the Christian forger isn't sure whether Christians in Anatolia would have been holding their meetings on Sunday, like he probably did, or on Saturday, as some Christians in the late 2nd century were also known to do. The letter of Ignatius to the Magnesians, and Magnesia was a city in western Anatolia, and I would put the letters of Ignatius in about the 170s, about 30 to 60 years later than the theologians do. The author says this, quote, "We should no longer observe the Sabbath, but instead the Lord's Day." And by Sabbath, he means Saturday, and this is typical Christian language. First of all, they're back to their permanent pastime of trashing sectarian rivals, but anytime you see anything written in these books where it's like, we should really do X and not Y, it's an indication that more people were doing X than were doing Y. The 4th century church historian Socrates says, quote, "Almost all churches in the world celebrate the sacred mysteries on the Sabbath of every week, but the Christians of Alexandria and at Rome, because of some ancient tradition, no longer do this." Tertullian, who's one of our prime suspects for the forgery of Pliny's letter, says, quote, We solemnize the day after Saturday in distinction to those who call this day their Sabbath and devote it to ease and eating, deviating from the old Jewish customs which they're now very ignorant of. And that's of tremendous importance because he's saying that there are Christians in his time who venerate Saturday and not Sunday. And this is the exact time period in which Pliny's letter was forged. And Tertullian's African church, which did observe Sunday, was effectively a colony of the Roman church, which also observed Sunday, as we know from the writings of Justin. And by the way, if you ever want to read like 1,000 more quotes like this, where the early Christians kept pointing out observance of Saturday, just call up a Seventh-day Adventist apologist. They'll pour a honeyed potion in your ear, and one day you'll wake up and all you'll say is, Saturday, Saturday. So many Christians in those early days did observe Saturday. And the forger caught himself here. In fact, I guarantee that in the first draft of this letter, the forger had Pliny say they were in the habit of meeting every week on Sunday before dawn. And then he must have realized that, whoa, I'm going to be opening an entire can of worms if I write that, so I'll just keep it El Generico. And that's why we have this damn strange usage of the term fixed day, which is why we red-carded Pliny for peculiarities of style. Back after this. I now display a red card to Pliny the Younger for what he says about the lapsed Christians giving up their weekly meetings because of Trajan's ban on hetaireias. And these were social clubs, fraternities, civic organizations, little brotherhoods that were formed by private citizens. And this is 2 red cards in one for intertextuality, one for peculiarities of the situation. On intertextuality, we spoke somewhat about this in the intro when I talked about Sherwin-White, and he said that it was unlikely that a forger would have known about Trajan's ban of clubs, and as I said, it was actually referenced by Trajan in basically the previous letter to this one, pretty much. Now, on the subject of Trajan's ban, there's no real hard evidence of it other than allusions here and there, so when Sherwin-White says that a forger wouldn't know about the ban, it's not like we ourselves have discovered the actual source for the ban that would have been unknown to the forger. I mean, it's really just extrapolated from Pliny's letters and from certain other documents that we found over time, like a papyrus fragment that was pulled out of an ancient garbage dump in Egypt. It's the Oxyrhynchos Papyrus 1029, and it's funny because it's written by a small fraternity of hieroglyphics carvers, and they're listing their members. There are 5 members, and it's written during the reign of Trajan. And they're like, we swear there's no more than 5 of us. We swear. Trust me. Here's a copy of all 5 of our driver's licenses. There's not, you can come and count us if you want, please, by all means. So clearly there was a ban on these type of organizations unless they had a specific license and clearly defined their approved members, as this Carvers Guild apparently did. And Trajan's concern in banning them was that these little societies might become focal points of opposition or rebellion. And for that reason, he forbids Pliny from allowing one of the cities in Bithynia to form a company of firemen. And it's important to note that we, because of that papyrus that I just mentioned, know more about this ban than the forger did. The forger only knew about it from an offhand reference in a previous letter. And from the writings of the late 2nd century Christians, whenever they write about Roman history, as I pointed out in episode 13, they always seem to be getting their knowledge about earlier times from Roman history books, like those of Tacitus and others. Like there's no oral tradition or lived experience passed down. The forger here in the 190s didn't interview anyone who remembered Trajan's ban or its implications. He provides no more information about it than was already hinted at in Pliny's letters. I mean, he's a hack, basically. But why I think he mentioned the ban of hetaireias in the Pliny letter at all was A, for verisimilitude, but also B, he knew he was in a lot of trouble because the Pliny letter is operating in this legal black hole, and that's by design. Because he wants to portray Pliny as being totally ignorant of any laws or procedures against Christians, wants to have Pliny invent on his own a procedure that's favorable to Christians, and then have Trajan sign off on it. The problem is, there are actual existing laws that might come into play and affect this, and one of them is this ban on clubs that he learned about from the other letters. So he has to account for it in some way. And so he has Pliny say that the lapsed Christians told him that they gave up their weekly meetings because of Trajan's ban on clubs. So his mention of it earns him a red card for intertextuality because he's in dialogue with Pliny's letter 93. But I said that he earned another red card here for peculiarities of the situation. Now, why? Well, think about this. The first thing that the apostate Christians say to Pliny is, some of us gave up Christianity 3 years ago. Some gave it up earlier than that. And a few of us even gave it up 20 years ago. Then they say, when we were Christians, we used to meet together and hold a ceremony and have a meal. Then they say, we stopped doing this because of Trajan's ban on clubs. Now, the earliest that Trajan could have banned clubs would have been in 98 AD when he began to rule. And this is all supposedly taking place in 112 AD. So, are the apostate Christians saying that some of them gave up meeting together 20 years ago because of Trajan's ban on clubs? That is like before he became emperor. And yeah, I get that some of them gave up Christianity within the past few years, and those may have done it because of Trajan's ban, but it's a bit confusing the way it's worded in the text. It seems like what the forger was trying to do was think of a way that he could account for the ban on social clubs without, and this is key, without making it appear as if the Christians were being tried for belonging to a social club. Now, many commentators on Pliny's letter, including Bart Ehrman, assume that the Christians ended up in front of Pliny in the first place because they were identified as belonging to an illegal club, even though there's no evidence of that, and Pliny doesn't say that, and he certainly doesn't conduct his trial as if that were the case, because then he'd have absolutely no question as to what the procedure is. The procedure would be, you belong to a club, therefore you're suspect. But he doesn't do that. Like I said, the forger wanted to account for the ban without making the ban the reason why the Christians were tried, even though, according to many theologians, the reason that the Christians were supposedly tried in the first place was because of the ban. And like I said, this letter was originally released, if you will, as a standalone letter, and it became part of a compilation of forged Christian texts that Tertullian used. A few centuries later, when a Christian published Book 10 of Pliny's letters, this Christian's letter was included for the first time as part of the collection. And the forger didn't know quite where to stick it, so for several reasons, the primary of which was at this point in the collection, Trajan had just got done talking about the ban on clubs, the compiler stuck it here. And it became our letters 1096 and 1097. By the way, I mentioned Bart Ehrman, and he actually writes about Pliny's letter in his book, Did Jesus Exist? And I think that this is important to note. He discusses Pliny's letter, but he gets hella facts wrong about it. He says, for example, quote, in his letter 10 to the emperor, Pliny discusses the fire problem, and in that context, he mentions another group that was illegally gathering together. As it turns out, it was the local community of Christians. And he says that letter number 10 is important because in it, Pliny appears to mention the existence of Jesus. Now, I said earlier that out of any historical figure, I would like to invite Tertullian to dinner so I could grill him over his Pliny reference. I would now also add Bart Ehrman to that bill, and I would ask him what incarnation he thinks he's talking about here. Letter number 10 is a short paragraph in which Pliny thanks Trajan for granting a favor to his therapist. He might be referring to letter 33, where Pliny talks about the fire in Nicomedia and asks permission to form the company of firemen. But that letter does not mention Jesus in the slightest. In point of fact, if there is such a thing as doing the opposite of mentioning Jesus, that's what letter 33 does. And it doesn't mention, by the way, an illegal group gathering together at all. Now, why I bring this up is to illustrate the typical methods that are used by theologians to defend Pliny's letter. In this case, fitting the theme of this really inflammatory book by Bart Ehrman, which I take very personally, he kind of diffidently dismisses the idea that Pliny's letter is a forgery, but as we see, he doesn't really seem to have reviewed it prior to writing about it. He's like someone who didn't do the homework. And think back to what I said in episode 10 about how theologians and apologists just want to angrily insist that the Pliny letter is real, that it provides early support for Christianity, and move on. These mistakes are inexcusable unless he was trying to deliberately mislead the reading public, which in this case, he was self-consciously writing to a more popular audience than the one to which he normally writes. And also, think back to what I said even earlier in this very episode. Most of us seem to have a received narrative about Pliny's letter and what it says, kind of like how everyone somehow knows that the American natives used the entire buffalo. I mean, everyone knows that Pliny's letter is some kind of scenario in which Christians were on trial and he was seeking advice. That's it. And Bart Ehrman, despite being trained in this material, despite being more of a credentialist by far than any other theologian that I've read, appears to also accept and amplify that received narrative. But as I've shown through this close reading, Pliny's letter is something that needs to be analyzed carefully, and it rewards that type of analysis, and the theologians don't generally do that type of analysis. Moving on. Here's another quick red card for Pliny, peculiarities of the situation. Pliny says that he learned all about Christianity from the apostate Christians, and then apropos of nothing, in a sentence that actually looks like it was added by a later writer, he says, "So I believed it all the more necessary to find out what was going on, and I tortured 2 slave women." There was no indication in his previous statements that he felt like he was getting bad information from the apostates or insufficient information. It's just that this forged letter has an internal logic to it, and as we'll talk about in a bit, Pliny needs to end his investigation still believing that Christianity is evil. The forger's trying to create a scenario in which Pliny is still mad at them by the end of the letter. So, for no discernible reason, he doesn't even say that he didn't like or believe what the apostates told him about Christian practices. He says, "Anyway, I had to find the truth, so I tortured the 2 slaves, and yeah, I found out that it's still a big threat." It's totally illogical if the letter is genuine, but perfectly explicable if it's a forgery. Now on this, the theologian E.A. Judge said that what happened here was that Pliny was dissatisfied with the testimony of the apostate Christians because it was too sunny. Temilin Sitch. They gave him too pretty of a picture. Hence, he tortured the slaves to find out the real truth. And there's no support for that in the text. This is one of those problems with the Pliny letter that I keep mentioning, the ones that theologians are well aware of, but apologists and general believers are not. And they come up with half-baked pseudo-explanations like this to explain these problems away. Moving on. Pliny also gets a red card for anachronism when he says that he tortured 2 women called ministers, which is the typical Latin translation for deacons. Now, deacons are a post-150 AD institution. They're mentioned in the pastoral letters, which are some of the latest documents in the New Testament, and I put those after 150. And they're mentioned in Acts, which happens to be intertextual with the pastoral letters, and I put Acts in that same time period. But actually, the author of Acts tries to be cute and avoids using the term deacons, but he kind of hints at it because he has Peter use a verb that signifies waiting on tables, which is the same as the root word for the term deacon. That Acts author is far too clever by half, but deacons and female deacons in particular are also mentioned in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 16. It's a letter of recommendation for a woman named Phoebe, whom he says was a deacon at the church in the port of Corinth. Not Corinth itself, but its port, which was a far smaller town. And Romans 16 is one of the very few parts of the New Testament where even conservative theologians agree that it may not be original to the letter. Even Origen says that some copies in his time didn't include it. And what it is, like I said, it's a letter of recommendation that appears not to be addressed to people in Rome, which is the actual destination of the letter to the Romans, but in Ephesus. And it ends up being like a massive series of shout-outs to all these Christian personalities there. There's dozens of them. It ends up being like the Sgt. Pepper's album cover, but here we have clear textual evidence that this document was not originally part of a letter to the Romans. And it mentions deacons, and it mentions, of course, a female deacon. And it looks like what happened was that the letter to the Romans, which is Paul's big statement of his theology and beliefs about salvation, appeared to lack a satisfying conclusion. And in fact, there's also some evidence that it even lacked chapter 15 at first, let alone chapter 16. And a series of Christian editors tacked those on over the years, and from the textual evidence, this had to have occurred late in the 2nd century. So therefore, we have no conclusive proof that the original writer of Romans knew anything about female deacons or deacons at all. Because for all we know, this part could have been added to the letter in the year 180. The textual evidence allows for that. The other thing about deacons to remember is that for there to be deacons, it implies that there are bishops. In almost every context in which deacons are brought up in early Christianity, they are brought up as subordinates of the bishops. And indeed, that is exactly the scenario that is portrayed in Acts of the Apostles. The apostles in Acts are portrayed as almost like the bishops or the presbyters, and Peter is made to say that we don't have time to wait on tables, and that whole story is a reference to Moses appointing judges in the book of Exodus. But to make their lives easier, the apostles appoint 7 subordinates. And what prompted all this was that some widows were complaining that they were being overlooked in the daily table service. And the care of widows, and particularly bringing food to them and bringing the Eucharist to them and to others who can't make it to church, is one of the primary responsibilities of deacons in the later Christian literature. So the Acts author clearly means to telegraph that these are deacons that the apostles are appointing. So for there to be deacons in the time of Pliny, there had to be a relatively advanced church order by that time. Now, if this church that Pliny is persecuting is advanced enough to have deacons, then why wasn't he able to get his hands on any presbyters or bishops? These would have been the ringleaders of this little organization that he's so keen on snuffing out. It seems to me that what the forger wanted to do was to give Pliny a reason to still consider Christianity a threat after he'd heard that lovely testimony from the apostates, like I talked about a few moments ago, but he couldn't just have it come from 2 slave women. He needed them to have some kind of authority. Otherwise, their testimony wouldn't be as weighty. So he figured, well, I'll make it out to where he ended up torturing actual church officials, but to be safe, I'll make it the lowliest church officials, the deacons. And he had access to Romans chapter 16 and was under the impression that it was early and genuine. He certainly had no reason to assume otherwise. And so he thought, well, in the earliest days of the church, there were already female deacons, apparently. And no doubt there were therefore female deacons in Pliny's time, 80 or 90 years before me. So this is a red card for anachronism for obvious reasons, but it's also a red card for intertextuality because I think the reason that the forger had Pliny torture 2 female deacons was that he knew that there were female deacons at this time from Romans 16. I mean, it's weird that he goes out of his way to identify their gender, is it not? And I think he was trying to play it safe. He may have recognized that his sources didn't mention male deacons in those ancient times, but they mentioned female deacons here in Romans 16. And of course, Acts of the Apostles, which he was also aware of, like I said, Acts doesn't specifically call them deacons, and the church itself wouldn't get into the habit of calling them that is the 7 appointed by the apostles, until somewhat later. Justin Martyr also references deacons in the late 150s. He says that their job is to serve the Eucharist and to bring it to the homes of those who aren't present. And he says that they serve as subordinates of someone whom he calls the president. Now, lastly on this, Paul's letter to the Romans. The theologians mostly believe that it was written around 55 AD. On Rodney Stark's model of the growth of Christianity that we talked about earlier, there were something like 1,500 Christians in the entire world at this time. How likely is it that there would have been an established church order with deacons in place in even a tiny port like Cenchrea, the port of Corinth? That in and of itself should be an indication that Romans 16, with its mention of deacons, was written way later than 55 AD. Now on my timeline, Romans 16 was written around the year 170, and I have about 80,000 Christians existing in the world at that time on my model. Makes much more sense. Our last red card for today that we issue to the punch-drunk Pliny, 2-in-1, intertextuality and style. Pliny says that when he tortured the deaconesses, he found nothing but a perverse and immoderate superstition. Superstitionem pravam et immodicam. Whoa, can he say that? First, these Latin words pravus and immodicus. On the word pravus, Quintilian says, character is best molded when it's still guiltless of deceit and most susceptible to instruction, because once a pravus habit has become ingrained, it's easier to break than bend. On the word immodicus, Suetonius says that Domitian was immodicus in his actions, and as an example, he says that one time a woman offered him a kiss, and he presented her with his hand for her to kiss. So these are quasi-insults. The forger is again pulling his punches, like with the word amentia or madness. And this here is in fact the worst thing that Pliny can conjure up to say about Christianity. So it's a red card for style for that reason, but also, what the hell is Pliny talking about? He just learned 95% of what someone would need to learn about this religion when he interviewed the apostates. He learned that they worship Christ. He learned about their dawn service, prayers, agape meal. Like, what else could he possibly have learned from torturing these two women? What else did they tell him? That like Christians don't sell wine on Sunday and he didn't like that and decided that now they were up to something? The thing is, this is one of those places where the forgery is obvious because the forger took Pliny on a journey where he realized that the Christians weren't really doing anything wrong. But at the end of the day, he has to still consider it a crime. That's what the persecution trope requires. So it would be weird if Pliny told Trajan, hey, I investigated this and found nothing wrong whatsoever. Then the reader might expect Trajan to say something like, well, if they're not doing anything wrong, then let them all go free. But the forger is much more sophisticated than that. He has to have Pliny's investigation end on a dark note. So he tells us that Pliny tortured 2 slaves and learned something horrible about Christianity that he hadn't learned before. I don't know, maybe they had that briefcase from Pulp Fiction that he stared into and it deeply affected him, but we, the readers, don't get to know what Pliny learned, what he saw in that briefcase. And now, of course, the table is set for Trajan to also consider Christianity a threat, but not enough of a threat to where Christians should be hunted down. And of course, this is a red card also for intertextuality because just like the fake passages about Christians in Tacitus and Suetonius, Pliny uses the word superstition to describe Christianity. Now, superstition is also a word that Tertullian uses a lot. And I suspect that if he wasn't the forger of this, he was at least somehow involved in the forgery in some way. And we'll know more once the FBI completes their investigation because what I did was I tweeted at the FBI on Twitter and tagged Tertullian. So hopefully they'll open an investigation on him in due course over the forgery of this letter. But the word superstition is very special to Tertullian because he says that that's what the Romans call Christianity. But at the same time, he uses it to refer to pagan worship. So it's kind of like a literary trick that he's doing. It's kind of like how in Life of Brian, where the Romans and the Jews kept calling each other big nose. It's like, you're the superstition. No, you're the superstition. So I think there's a lot more in play there in the use of this word than what we can get out of a surface level reading. By the way, many analysts of this letter, including Richard Carrier, believe that Christianity is being treated as illegal by Pliny because it represents an illegal social club. If that's the case, would we expect the term superstition to be used all the time when describing it? Like, what does superstition have to do with an illegal social club? It rather seems like this letter was written by someone whose opinion was that the Romans hated Christians just because of what they believed, as with the forged Tacitus passage, as with the forged Suetonius passage, as with all the other books by the late 2nd century apologists, and as with the forger of Pliny's letter to Trajan about the Christians. Before we leave off for today, I want to revisit the passage from the radical critic T.L. Strange that we began reading in episode 13. As I said there, he's one of the heroes of this telebroadcast. We read his treatment of the first part of Pliny's letter, and he described how ridiculous it was that Pliny would represent himself as not knowing anything about Christians but would punish them anyway. And he called it scene painting of a very inartistic kind. And he continues from there, quote, "After this, strange to say, Pliny is made to appear fully aware of all that it concerned him to know of the Christian tenets." And then T.L. Strange summarizes what Pliny says about the Christian tenets. It's what we covered in today's close reading. And then he picks back up. "It's easy to see here the hand of the painter. We have one scheming to make the best possible representation of his creed and to magnify its success. Those who followed this creed were, even under the description of their persecutors, the holiest and most blameless of men, suffering death without a cause, yet covering the land with converts. The Romans were tolerant of all religions, and it would therefore have been a direct violation of the laws and policy of Rome for anyone to have acted towards a body of harmless people with the senseless brutality attributed to Pliny. But the emperor's reply to his subordinate is said to have been mild and merciful. He approves of the governor's conduct as explained in his letter, says that the Christians are not to be sought for, nor anonymous accusations against them received, and that the test to be applied when they were brought up was to be their consent to worship the Roman divinities. In short, the reply is one in appearance only and destitute of realities. It neither rebukes the subordinate who stands committed to the extremes of feebleness and cruelty, nor gives him any solid instructions for his future guidance. End quote. Today, we've made use of our red cards in aid of demonstrating that Pliny's letter to the Christians is actually a Christian forgery of the late 100s AD. We recommence next time with the finale of our Pliny series, always remembering that it's not impossible that this is a forgery. In the name of St. Candida, we again declare the letter of Pliny to be late and spurious. Thank you for listening. This criticism is ended. Go in peace.
What other stories of mythology do you think of as historical reality?